I flew back to the States as a surprise for my grandson's second birthday. I went to the house where my late son used to live. At the party, my daughter-in-law screamed in front of everyone, "That grandson is not even yours. I want you to die too." I stood speechless at the humiliation. Patricia's words hung in the air while a deadly silence invaded the garden. The guests, friends, family, neighbors, they all froze with glasses and plates halfway to their mouths, their faces paralyzed between disbelief and horror. Little Matthew was oblivious to the emotional earthquake unleashed at his own birthday party. He kept playing with a fire truck in the corner of the patio. I felt the blood drain from my face as 30 pairs of eyes locked onto me, waiting for my reaction. At 68 years old, I thought I had experienced every possible form of pain. The self-imposed exile in London for 7 years, the loss of my only son Charles in that car accident, the loneliness of waking up every morning in a foreign country, knowing that the only family I had left was on the other side of the ocean. But nothing had prepared me for this public humiliation, this devastating denial of my only comfort, my grandson. I did not scream. I did not make a scene. I did not crumble either, even though I felt something fundamental break inside me. Instead, with a calm that surprised even Patricia, I carefully placed the gift I had brought from England on the gift table. It was a perfect replica of a historic castle built with special magnetic blocks for toddlers. "Excuse me," I said simply, with a voice that did not sound like my own. "I believe my presence is inappropriate." I walked toward the garden exit with measured steps, feeling the unbearable weight of stairs on my back. When I passed by Matthew, I stopped briefly. The boy looked up. He had the same hazel eyes as Charles, the same as my father, the same as mine. He smiled at me with that absolute innocence that only the very young possess. "Grandpa, go," he said, in his 2-year-old language, extending his little hand toward me. Something in that gesture, in that pure connection uncontaminated by adult complexities. It crystallized a determination inside me, a quiet but unbreakable certainty. I would not abandon this child, not without fighting with every resource at my disposal. "I will be back," I whispered discreetly, caressing his hair for a brief instant, and I left the party. Not as a defeated man fleeing humiliation, but as a strategist retreating temporarily to plan his next move. My name is James Miller. I was born in Chicago in 1955. I am the son of a university professor who dedicated his life to history and a mother who gave up a promising career as a pianist to raise 3 children. I grew up in a modest house, but it was full of books, music, and passionate conversations about art, science, and politics. My father did not possess material wealth, but he left me something equally valuable, an unbreakable work ethic and the conviction that knowledge was the only possession no one could take away from you. With those principles as my compass, I worked my way from public university toward a career in architecture that eventually allowed me to found my own firm. The first years were difficult. I shared a small studio with 2 colleagues. We accepted any project that allowed us to pay the rent, and we worked endless days to establish a reputation of impeccable professionalism. The opportunity that transformed our trajectory arrived unexpectedly, an international contest to design a cultural center in Seattle. Our design, which integrated traditional elements with contemporary concepts of sustainability, won against established firms with infinitely superior resources. Overnight, Miller and Associates went from being an unknown studio to receiving proposals from all over the country. We methodically built our reputation during the next decade. By the time Charles was born in 1982, I was the senior partner of one of the most respected architecture firms in America, with projects in 4 countries and a team of 50 professionals. The firm specialized in cultural and educational architecture, museums, universities, libraries, spaces that fused identity with progressive vision. My wife Elizabeth was an art historian I met during the construction of a museum in Boston. She became my most valuable collaborator. While I designed the structures, she guaranteed that every space told a story consistent with its cultural environment. We formed a perfect team personally and professionally, complementing each other in every aspect of our lives. Charles grew up among architectural blueprints and art history books. From a young age, he showed insatiable curiosity and exceptional sensitivity toward shapes and spaces. At 6 years old, he was already drawing structures with intuitively correct perspective. At 12, he won his first school design contest. His adolescence coincided with the firm's most ambitious expansion. We opened offices in London and Bogota. We implemented a sustainable architecture department when it was barely beginning to be discussed, and established a scholarship program for underprivileged architecture students. The pace of work was frantic but stimulating. You are building an empire, but at what cost? Elizabeth questioned me one night after I missed Charles's school play for the third time in a row. It was not a reproach, but a genuine question that forced me to seriously reflect on my priorities. I made significant adjustments. I delegated more responsibilities. I rejected projects that would have required prolonged absences, and I established inviolable family time. I took Charles to visit iconic construction sites. We discussed structural solutions during dinner, and I integrated him gradually into appropriate aspects of the business. By the time he entered university following the predictable path of architecture, our relationship had evolved from father and son to something close to a mentorship between colleagues. His approach differed refreshingly from mine. Where I prioritized functionality and contextual harmony, he explored innovative materials and sensory experiences. We will be the perfect balance when you formally join the firm, I told him the night he showed me his final thesis, an ambitious urban regeneration project that combined historical rehabilitation with experimental community spaces. However, to my surprise, Charles decided not to join the family business immediately. I need to find my own voice before joining yours, he explained. If I enter the firm directly, I will always be the son of James Miller, not Charles Miller, the architect. Although initially disappointed, I respected his decision. He worked for 3 years with a renowned studio in San Francisco. Then he collaborated on humanitarian projects in South America. Each experience refined his vision and strengthened his professional confidence. When he finally returned to Los Angeles and accepted a position at Miller and Associates, he did it on his own terms. He established the participatory architecture department involving communities directly in design processes. His projects won international recognition for their balance between social sensitivity and technical rigor. It was during a social housing project where he met Patricia Henderson. An economist specializing in urban development, Patricia worked for the state, supervising the implementation of housing programs. Smart, decisive, and apparently passionate about improving living conditions in vulnerable communities. She immediately captured Charles's attention. Their courtship was intense but brief. Less than a year after meeting, they announced their engagement during a family dinner. Elizabeth discreetly expressed some reservations about the speed of the decision, but I was simply happy seeing my son so in love. Or so I thought. The wedding was celebrated at a restored vineyard in Napa Valley. It was an elegant but intimate event. Patricia was radiant in a dress that combined traditional elements with contemporary design. She captivated everyone present. Her parents were textile entrepreneurs and showed evident satisfaction with the union to a family established in architectural and cultural circles. The first months of marriage seemed to confirm the suitability of the relationship. Charles and Patricia bought a plot of land on the outskirts of the city where he personally designed their house. It was an impressive structure that fused sustainable principles with minimalist aesthetics. Professionally, they teamed up for projects that integrated economic viability with humanist design. The first sign of turbulence arrived approximately 1 year after the wedding. Elizabeth was always perceptive about interpersonal dynamics. She noticed subtle changes during family visits. Patricia began to show barely disguised impatience when Charles shared enthusiastic ideas for non-commercial projects. Small dismissive comments about idealistic architecture that does not pay mortgages, or dreams that must wait until we establish solid financial bases. There is something calculating in her support. Elizabeth commented after Patricia suggested that Charles reconsider participating in a pro bono project for a community center, as if she were constantly evaluating the return on emotional investment. I tried to reassure her, attributing these observations to different generational perspectives on the balance between professional passion and economic practicality. We all make adjustments during the first years of marriage, I argued. They will find their balance. Patricia's pregnancy, announced during the celebration of their second anniversary, initially seemed to reinforce their marital bonds. Charles was radiant, immediately transforming the spare room into a meticulously designed nursery. Patricia, although less effusive, seemed content while accepting maternal advice from Elizabeth about prenatal preparations. However, as the pregnancy advanced, underlying tensions intensified. Patricia began to publicly question Charles's professional decisions, especially those that prioritized social impact over immediate profitability. What initially seemed like practical suggestions evolved into direct criticisms about his financial naivety and lack of strategic ambition. During a particularly uncomfortable family dinner, Patricia announced unilaterally that Charles would reduce his participation in international projects to concentrate on more lucrative local opportunities. My son's momentarily disoriented expression revealed that this decision had not exactly been consensual. We need to establish economic security before the baby is born. Patricia explained, caressing her 6-month bump while smiling with unsettling determination. Charles finally understands that he must think like a responsible heir, not like a perpetual idealist. The explicit reference to being an heir disturbed me particularly. It was the first time Patricia mentioned financial inheritance considerations so directly in a family context. Elizabeth, always more direct than me, addressed the topic immediately. Miller and Associates has never prioritized accumulation over purpose. She commented with polite firmness. The firm's reputation was built precisely on the balance between professional excellence and social responsibility. Charles continues that tradition admirably. Traditions evolve, Patricia responded, maintaining a smile that did not reach her eyes, especially when family responsibilities enter the equation. The birth of Matthew initially seemed to calm the rising tensions. Charles was completely in love with the little one, adapting his professional schedules to participate actively in childcare. Patricia, although less visibly, involved emotionally, meticulously organized practical aspects. Hiring a certified nanny, a renowned pediatrician, early stimulation with recommended specialists. Elizabeth and I intensely enjoyed our role as grandparents. We visited regularly, offering practical support while respecting the space of the new family. Matthew quickly developed a special bond with us, especially with Elizabeth, who invented games that simultaneously entertained and stimulated the little one's cognitive development. Patricia's reaction to this close relationship between grandparents and grandson was contradictory. Publicly, she expressed gratitude for family support. Privately, she implemented increasingly elaborate restrictions for visits. Structured schedules are essential for healthy child development. She justified it by establishing specific windows for family interaction that conveniently coincided with her own external commitments. Approximately when Matthew turned 1, Charles began to show signs of growing restlessness. Phone conversations with him revealed barely contained professional frustration. Patricia had suggested he decline participation in a prestigious international competition to concentrate on a local commercial project that was significantly less challenging but immediately profitable. It is temporarily necessary, He explained with resignation that contrasted painfully with his characteristic passion. We are building bases for a more stable future. Elizabeth, worried about the evident changes in our son's spirit, tried a direct conversation during a later visit. Her observation was met with unusually defensive resistance. Mom, I appreciate your concern, but my relationship with Patricia is more complex than you perceive from the outside, he responded tensely. We make mutual adjustments to build a solid family for Matthew. However, the evidence of mutuality in these adjustments seemed questionable. Charles gradually abandoned personally significant projects. He reduced contact with international colleagues who had inspired the more innovative aspects of his work. He even modified his architectural style toward approaches that were commercially safer but creatively conservative. The most painful transformation, however, occurred in his personality. The passionate young man who fervently debated social responsibility in architecture was being replaced by a cautious professional who prioritized practical calculations over transformative vision. His characteristic humor, once spontaneous and contagious, now appeared mainly in publicly performative situations. Elizabeth and I privately discussed these worrying changes, debating whether to intervene more directly or respect the autonomy of their adult marriage. Our indecision ended abruptly with a devastating call that would fundamentally change our lives. Charles had suffered a severe car accident. While driving during an intense storm on the highway, supervising the construction of a community center, a personal project, he had kept quiet, apparently. Without Patricia's knowledge, he lost control of the vehicle on a particularly treacherous curve. The following days were a blur of the hospital, doctors with grave expressions, and Patricia alternating between impressive practical organization and baffling emotional detachment. Elizabeth remained constantly by Charles's bedside, speaking to him, holding his hand, bravely resisting, while doctors explained the extensive brain damage and the increasingly grim prognosis. In contrast, Patricia divided her time between the hospital and the office, where she apparently managed urgent financial matters. Her hospital visits, although regular, were brief and focused mainly on consultations with doctors about technical aspects of the treatment, rarely on emotional connection with Charles. When we finally lost our son, I experienced pain that seemed physically unbearable, as if a fundamental part of my own being had been ripped out without anesthesia. Elizabeth, always my rock during previous crises, was equally devastated. We held each other up during those dark days, finding the only possible comfort in Matthew, who at 18 months obviously did not understand the permanence of the loss, but clearly felt the absence of his father. Patricia's behavior during the funeral and subsequent days was the subject of discreet but widespread comments. Her composure was impeccable, almost studied. She organized services with surprising efficiency. She managed immediate financial aspects with admirable precision, and she maintained a publicly appropriate facade of a grieving widow. However, close observers noticed disturbing details. The absence of tears even during the most intensely emotional moments, barely disguised impatience during prolonged condolences, and most revealing almost complete physical and emotional detachment toward Matthew during the entire process. Elizabeth tried to maintain a constant connection with our grandson during the following weeks, offering practical support and emotional comfort to both Patricia and the little one. Initially, Patricia accepted the help, apparently grateful for assistance, while managing the transition to widowhood. However, approximately a month after the funeral, the dynamic changed abruptly. Patricia began a systematic implementation of barriers between us and Matthew. Visits canceled due to convenient illnesses, sudden commitments during previously agreed times, and eventually the direct explanation that Matthew needs stability without constant reminders of his loss. The implication was painfully clear. Our presence supposedly activated trauma in the little boy by reminding him of his father. It was a psychologically dubious argument, especially considering the evident joy Matthew showed during our increasingly rare interactions. The situation reached a critical point when Patricia announced plans to move permanently to another city, where she had supposedly received an extraordinary professional opportunity in an urban development firm. The geographic distance would effectively limit regular visits, reducing our participation in Matthew's life to strictly controlled occasional encounters. Elizabeth, devastated at the possibility of losing meaningful connection with her only grandson, proposed reasonable alternatives, scheduling regular visits, establishing consistent virtual communication, even offering financial support for an additional nanny to facilitate more frequent meetings. Patricia's response was polite, but firmly negative. I appreciate the offers, but Matthew and I need to establish a new independent life. Excessive contact with the past would complicate healthy adaptation. The true motive behind Patricia's resistance became painfully evident when, during a particularly tense discussion, she mentioned unrealistic financial expectations and necessary clarifications about pending inheritance aspects. Discreet consultations with a family lawyer confirmed growing suspicions. Patricia had initiated detailed investigations into the corporate structure of Miller and Associates, Charles's specific shareholding participation, and potential succession scenarios considering Matthew's rights as the sole direct heir. This revelation posed an inevitable question. Had the marriage to Charles been primarily a strategic transaction for Patricia? Was Matthew valued mainly as a legally significant link to the Miller family fortune? Disturbing thoughts, perhaps unfair, but increasingly difficult to dismiss considering the observed behavior. The situation worsened dramatically when Elizabeth, trying to maintain some form of connection with our grandson, organized a small celebration for Matthew's first birthday after Charles's passing. It was a modest event at our house with a few close guests and a deliberately positive atmosphere for the benefit of the little one. Patricia attended briefly, visibly uncomfortable, allowing minimal interaction between grandparents and grandson, before announcing that an inviolable nap schedule required immediate withdrawal. Matthew's disappointment was palpable, provoking Elizabeth's first direct confrontation. He is enjoying the celebration with family who loves him. My wife argued with unusual firmness in her normally conciliatory temperament. A few additional minutes will not compromise his development, but they will build meaningful memories. I determine what is appropriate for my son. Patricia responded with unmistakable possessive emphasis. I appreciate the intention, but I would prefer you respect my parental authority. Elizabeth, deeply hurt, but determined to avoid open conflict that would potentially limit access to Matthew even further, conceded reluctantly. However, this incident crystallized a painful realization. Patricia was systematically eliminating our meaningful presence in Matthew's life. It was approximately then that Elizabeth received a diagnosis that would fundamentally change our situation. A serious heart condition that required specialized treatment, available primarily in London, where we had previously established a secondary office of the firm and maintained extensive professional connections. The decision to relocate temporarily to England was simultaneously practical and emotionally devastating. Necessary medical treatment was an indisputable priority, but the inevitable consequence would be even greater: geographic separation from Matthew during a critical period of his early development. Patricia received the news of our imminent departure with what seemed like barely concealed relief. She quickly reorganized a proposed farewell visit to coincide conveniently with an unavoidable commitment out of town. Our last interaction with Matthew before leaving was a very brief video call, during which Patricia remained present, continuously limiting any meaningful exchange. The following 7 years in London were a period of extreme contrasts. Professionally, I experienced an unexpected renaissance. The British office of Miller and Associates, previously a modest subsidiary, flourished under my renewed attention. collaborations with European firms, significant institutional projects, and critical recognition that validated the continued relevance of our architectural approach. Elizabeth, after the treatment stabilized, her condition resumed historical architectural research, which had been her passion before family and business responsibilities took precedence. She published an acclaimed monograph, established collaboration with the art history department at a major university, and developed an innovative methodology for digital cataloging of architectural heritage at risk. However, personally, we experienced a deep void that no professional success could compensate. Contact with Matthew was sporadic and superficial. Infrequent video calls strictly supervised, exchanges of generic messages evidently filtered by Patricia, and occasional photographs that documented physical growth, but revealed little about emotional development or emerging personality. Our attempts to establish a more meaningful connection, carefully selected educational gifts, invitations to visit England during school holidays, offers for us to travel to the U.S., they were systematically neutralized through increasingly implausible excuses. The geographic distance provided Patricia with the perfect tool to implement practically total exclusion while maintaining a public appearance of a normal family relationship. Naturally, they would visit more frequently if they did not live on the other side of the ocean. She would reasonably explain to mutual acquaintances, establishing a narrative where separation was the inevitable consequence of our residential choice, not the result of her active resistance. We tried to navigate the situation through strategic concessions, adjusting impossible schedules to fit the only window available for video calls, sending gifts specifically approved by Patricia to avoid her automatic rejection, even modifying communication to eliminate any reference to Charles, after Patricia suggested that such mentions were potentially disturbing for Matthew's adaptive process. Each concession, however, seemed simply to establish a precedent for additional limitations, never generating reciprocity or increased flexibility. The accumulated frustration was considerable, but we maintained a commitment to a non-confrontational approach, prioritizing any possible connection with Matthew over the satisfaction of directly confronting Patricia's evident manipulations. This restrictive dynamic reached an absurd level when, after costly professional restructuring to allow an extended visit to the U.S. during Matthew's school vacation, we discovered that Patricia had organized a unique educational opportunity in a summer program that conveniently coincided exactly with the proposed dates we had previously accepted. The evidence of deliberate obstruction was undeniable, provoking Elizabeth's first directly confrontational communication. Patricia, we have continuously demonstrated maximum flexibility respecting your parental authority. However, this pattern of systematic exclusion suggests a deliberate intention to eliminate our presence in Matthew's life. As grandparents, we have a legitimate relationship that deserves reciprocal respect. The response was revealing in its unexpected frankness. Matthew is establishing a healthy identity without unnecessary emotional complications. While I politely maintain basic communication out of consideration for Charles's memory, I honestly consider that the influence of distant grandparents is completely optional, not an automatic right. My exclusive priority is my son's well-being, according to my parental criteria. This explicit clarification of her perspective, although painful, finally provided indisputable understanding of the reality we faced. Patricia fundamentally did not value the grandparent-grandson relationship as meaningful for Matthew's development. Any allowed connection was a calculated concession, not a valued collaboration for the benefit of the child. This realization provoked a complete reevaluation of our approach. If 7 years of consistent concessions and unwavering cooperation had resulted solely in the progressive erosion of the relationship with our grandson, an alternative strategy deserved consideration. Consultations with legal specialists, both British and American, revealed a complex panorama, but not completely hopeless. While the law effectively provides significant parental authority to the surviving parent, it also conceptually recognizes limited but existing rights of grandparents, particularly when a significant previous relationship can be documented and when separation does not serve the best interest of the minor. Simultaneously, discrete research on Matthew and Patricia's current situation revealed potentially relevant details. Matthew apparently demonstrated adaptive difficulties in the school environment, while Patricia had established a relationship with a prominent businessman, significantly older, with extensive political connections but a questionable personal reputation. After extensive and painfully honest deliberation, Elizabeth and I took a decision that would irrevocably change the established dynamic. We would return permanently to the United States. We would establish a consistent presence close to Matthew, and if necessary, we would initiate a formal process to legally establish structured visitation rights. We did not anticipate immediate confrontation or automatic litigation, ideally constant geographic proximity. Eventually, it would normalize the relationship, demonstrating practical benefits for Patricia, available logistical support, additional personal time, which would potentially soften historical resistance. However, we were equally prepared for a scenario where legal intervention became inevitable. Meticulous documentation of communication attempts, records of systematic obstructions, and professional testimonies about the importance of intergenerational relationships would form the foundation for a potential case. The news of our imminent return, shared via a deliberately casual email, generated an immediate response from Patricia, a combination of superficial courtesy. "What a pleasant surprise to know you are returning," and preemptive establishment of limitations. Unfortunately, immediate schedules are completely compromised with pre-existing obligations. We anticipated this initial resistance and proceeded according to carefully developed planning. We returned discreetly, re-established permanent residence in the city, reactivated relevant professional connections, and systematically rebuilt an updated understanding of Matthew's specific circumstances, obtained information, confirmed concerns. He attended a prestigious private school but showed significant academic and social difficulties. He spent considerable time with domestic staff, while Patricia maintained an intensive professional and social schedule. And apparently he expressed consistent curiosity about his paternal family, formulating questions that generated visible discomfort in Patricia. Approximately 2 months after our return, we learned that Patricia was organizing a celebration for Matthew's 7th birthday, an apparently significant event at an exclusive country club with an elaborate superhero theme and an extensive guest list. Notably, we did not receive a formal invitation confirming the continuation of the exclusionary strategy, despite the elimination of the geographic barrier previously used as the main justification. After careful consideration, we took a strategically aggressive but emotionally necessary decision. We would attend without a formal invitation, presenting a personally selected gift, establishing a physical presence impossible to ignore politely in a public context. We anticipated discomfort, possibly discreet resistance. What we could not foresee was the scenario we would effectively encounter upon arriving discreetly at the celebration in progress. And so we return to the moment that opens this story. Patricia, evidently altered by our unexpected appearance, losing briefly the calculated posture she normally maintained in public interactions, revealing with brutal frankness the genuine perspective that underpinned her persistently exclusionary behavior. "That grandson is not even yours. I want you to die too." Words spoken impulsively, loud enough to create immediate silence among nearby guests, generating a shockwave of discomfort that quickly enveloped the entire party. While I retreated, apparently defeated, placing the gift carefully on the designated table, I formulated an unbreakable decision. This public humiliation did not represent the end of the battle for a meaningful relationship with my grandson, but precisely the turning point that would fundamentally transform the balance of power in a prolonged confrontation. Patricia had made a devastating strategic error. In intense emotional moments, people frequently reveal underlying truths normally hidden behind socially acceptable facades. Her impulsive but audible declaration had provided direct evidence precisely of the type legal specialists had identified as potentially transformative in disputes over grandparents' rights. Explicit demonstration of unjustified parental alienation. As I crossed the garden toward the exit, maintaining external dignity that contradicted the inner emotional storm, I mentally initiated the implementation of a response Patricia would never anticipate from a man she had previously categorized as an adversary, easily neutralized. That night, I could not sleep. Patricia's phrase, "That grandson is not even yours," resonated in my head like a relentless hammer. What had she exactly meant to insinuate? Was it simply a calculated emotional attack to hurt me, or did it contain some truth I was unaware of? Doubt, that subtle poison, began to infiltrate my mind. Elizabeth, perceiving my anguish, sat next to me on the terrace where I had sought refuge, near midnight. "You saw him, James," she said softly, taking my hand in hers. "Did you see Matthew? He has Charles's eyes, his same expression when he concentrates. He even makes that little gesture with his chin exactly like your father. I know," I responded, although the doubt persisted like a shadow. But then why would she say something like that? What does she gain with such a cruel lie in public? Desperation, Elizabeth concluded after considering it. Matthew has built a narrative where we are expendable intruders. Our reappearance threatens the absolute control she has established over Matthew's life, and by extension over the family fortune. The mention of the fortune crystallized something in my mind. From Patricia's perspective, Matthew represented a legal connection to the Miller assets, even if that biological connection were questioned. We need absolute certainty, I decided. Not for us, but for Matthew. If we are going to fight for him, we need to do it on completely firm ground. The next morning, I discreetly contacted Hector Vance, a private investigator who had worked occasionally for the firm, verifying credentials of potential international partners. A meticulous man with impeccable professional ethics and absolute discretion. "I need complete information on Patricia Henderson," I explained during a private meeting in a temporarily established office. "Particularly any documentation related to pregnancy, Matthew's birth, and associated medical certificates. Medical information is protected by confidentiality," Hector warned, "but there are associated administrative records that are legally accessible. Additionally, personal and professional relationships during the relevant period could provide significant context." During the next 2 weeks, we maintained a strategically low profile. We did not attempt additional contact with Patricia, allowing her to perceive our absence subsequent to the incident as a definitive withdrawal. Meanwhile, Hector implemented a methodological but discreet investigation, building gradually a detailed profile of Patricia's activities and associations. The preliminary report, presented in a meticulously organized folder, confirmed some suspicions while revealing completely unexpected elements. Number 1. Patricia effectively had been pregnant and given birth to Matthew, according to verifiable hospital records, eliminating the scenario of covert adoption or substitution. Number 2. During the period approximately coinciding with conception, Patricia simultaneously maintained a relationship with Charles and frequent contact with an old university classmate, Ernest Vance, currently an executive in government urban development. Number 3. Vance had transferred significant amounts to Patricia's personal account shortly after Matthew's birth, categorized ambiguously as family support. Number 4. Even more revealing. Patricia had discreetly consulted a lawyer specializing in family law approximately a month before Charles's accident specifically investigating inheritance rights in cases of questioned paternity. The implication was disturbing, but impossible to ignore. Patricia apparently considered the possibility that Charles was not Matthew's biological father and had proactively explored associated legal implications. This does not provide definitive certainty, Hector clarified, but it establishes a foundation for justified additional investigation. The optimal strategy seemed clear but emotionally complex, a genetic test that would definitively establish the biological relationship. Getting a DNA sample from Matthew without parental consent would be ethically questionable and potentially inadmissible legally. Confronting Patricia directly with preliminary evidence would likely provoke categorical denial and intensified resistance. After consultation with a legal specialist, we identified an alternative approach, a formal request through the judicial system arguing legitimate interest in the determination of biological relationship for the appropriate establishment of inheritance rights. This strategy implied immediate escalation to a legal level we had initially hoped to avoid. However, accumulated evidence suggested that more conciliatory approaches would be systematically neutralized as long as Patricia perceived strategic advantage in continued exclusion. We meticulously prepared required documentation, including collected circumstantial evidence, personal testimony about the development of the grandparent-grandson relationship prior to Charles's death, and a professional declaration from a child psychologist about the importance of family identity clarification for the minor's well-being. The legal notification delivered formally to Patricia approximately 1 month after the birthday incident provoked an immediate and revealing reaction. Instead of argumentative resistance or predictable indignation, Patricia surprisingly requested private mediation before formal judicial proceedings, suggesting finding a mutually beneficial resolution without unnecessary public exposure. This response, strategically conciliatory but fundamentally evasive, confirmed the significant impact of our more assertive approach. The preference for private negotiation over transparent judicial proceedings suggested legitimate concern about potentially damaging revelations. We accepted the mediation proposal while simultaneously keeping the judicial request active as strategic pressure. The meetings scheduled in the neutral office of a certified mediator would represent the first direct interaction with Patricia since the public incident that catalyzed this new confrontational phase. Elizabeth and I meticulously prepared our negotiating position, establishing fundamental objectives, a structured and consistent relationship with Matthew, while maintaining flexibility on specific implementation, schedules, locations, visit modalities. Patricia arrived punctually at the mediator's office, accompanied surprisingly by Ernest Vance, presented formally as a personal advisor, although his presence in this specific context seemed to implicitly confirm relevance in the situation discussed. After formal introductions and establishment of procedural parameters by the experienced mediator, Patricia immediately took the initiative. Before discussing specific proposals, I need to clarify an unfortunate comment made during emotionally intense circumstances. She began with studied composure. The implication regarding Matthew's paternity was completely unfounded, a product of momentary frustration at an unexpected appearance that I perceived as disruptive to a carefully planned celebration. Her direct denial was predictable, but Vance's significant presence during this specific conversation seemed to implicitly contradict the explicit declaration. "We appreciate the clarification," I responded neutrally. "However, you will understand that such a specific declaration combined with circumstantial evidence regarding previous consultations related to paternity questioning naturally justifies concern about the biological relationship that underpins our rights as grandparents." The direct reference to previous consultations visibly destabilized Patricia's carefully maintained composure. A brief exchange of glances between her and Vance confirmed significant silent communication. Personal circumstances during the early relationship with Charles were complex. Patricia finally admitted modifying her strategy in the face of evidence of more detailed investigation than she anticipated. However, Charles never questioned paternity and is legally established as the father in all official documents. Indeed, I intervened, maintaining a conversational tone while implementing calculated pressure, precisely because of Charles's complete lack of knowledge about potential complexities. A situation that, considering the specific timing of certain legal consultations, you apparently intended to maintain indefinitely. The mediator, perceiving potentially counterproductive intensification, intervened skillfully. Perhaps we could focus the conversation toward shared interest in Matthew's present and future well-being, regardless of specific historical circumstances. This redirection provided an opportunity for Elizabeth, who had remained strategically silent, allowing me to establish initial pressure. Our only goal is a meaningful and constructive relationship with Matthew. She explained with evident sincerity that contrasted effectively with Patricia's calculated presentation. Regardless of potential biological complexities, 7 years of systematic exclusion have deprived a child of family connection that could provide additional emotional stability during critical development. Patricia, clearly recalibrating her approach in the face of evidence of our exhaustive preparation, adopted an apparently more conciliatory posture. I recognize that previous restrictions implemented initially during an intensely painful period possibly continued beyond genuine need. She offered carefully avoiding direct admission of deliberate obstruction. I would be willing to consider limited structured visits that respect Matthew's established routines. This initial concession, although significantly more restrictive than rights typically established judicially for grandparents in comparable circumstances, represented the first crack in the previously impenetrable wall of exclusion. We appreciate the willingness to reconsider your previous position. I responded, maintaining pressure while avoiding direct confrontation that would potentially end negotiation prematurely. However, considering the history of previous agreements systematically broken using variable justifications, any arrangement would require a formally legally binding structure, not simply an informal understanding subject to unilateral interpretation. Vance, who had maintained strategic silence during the initial exchange, finally intervened with a notably pragmatic approach. Patricia is genuinely willing to establish a constructive relationship that benefits Matthew's development while respecting primary parental authority. A reasonable formal structure would be acceptable as long as it includes appropriate flexibility for the child's evolving needs. This intervention, apparently conciliatory while simultaneously reaffirming primary parental authority, revealed a potentially significant dynamic. Vance adopting the role of internal mediator, facilitating strategic concessions while preserving Patricia's fundamental position. The subsequent negotiation, extending for approximately 3 hours, eventually produced a preliminary agreement significantly more substantive than we initially anticipated. Structured bi-weekly visits, scheduled weekly virtual communication, and guaranteed participation in significant school and family events. While the mediator formally documented agreed terms for legal review later, Elizabeth discreetly handed me a brief note, written during the last phases of negotiation. Too easy. They are buying time. Her intuition, historically reliable, generated justified unease. The transition from absolute resistance toward substantive concessions seemed suspiciously abrupt, considering consistent behavior during the 7 previous years. When we finished the session with appropriate formalities, Patricia and Vance withdrew, quickly citing pending professional commitments. Their behavior, although superficially cordial, projected barely disguised urgency that reinforced the sensation of an underlying strategy not completely revealed. "Something does not fit," I commented while we returned to our apartment. "We obtained significantly more than we expected. reasonably to get in the first negotiation, because it is not a genuine concession but a delaying tactic. Elizabeth responded with quiet certainty developed during decades of insightful observation of interpersonal dynamics. They are implementing something that requires time, and our immediate legal pressure threatened the established timeline. This interpretation seemed consistent with observed behavior, but implied a crucial question. What exactly were they implementing that required a specific time margin? Hector contacted discreetly that same afternoon, confirmed readiness to intensify situational monitoring during the immediate period, with particular attention toward activities potentially indicative of preparations for significant changes. Unusual financial transactions, communications with alternative educational institutions, or investigations into international residents. The first scheduled visit with Matthew, according to the newly established agreement, would occur in exactly 5 days. While we carefully prepared this crucial interaction after prolonged separation, we simultaneously maintained discreet but constant vigilance on Patricia's potentially revealing movements. What we would discover during those intermediate days would fundamentally transform our understanding of the situation faced and catalyze a significantly more aggressive response than initially contemplated. The first sign that our suspicions were justified arrived barely 2 days after the mediation. Hector contacted me urgently. They have requested expedited passports for both Patricia and Matthew, accelerated process with family emergency justification. This information clearly confirmed intention of imminent international departure. The critical question was temporary trip or permanent relocation, designed to evade newly established agreements and U.S. legal jurisdiction. Additional instructions to Hector quickly revealed a pattern consistent with the second hypothesis. Patricia had discreetly listed her apartment with a real estate agency, requested Matthew's complete educational records from the current school, and made inquiries about international academic equivalencies. Probable destination is Chile, Hector informed the next day. Vance has significant business connections there. They have specifically investigated private schools in the eastern sector of the capital and immigration requirements for permanent residents in Chile. The evidence was conclusive. They planned to disappear before the formal agreement was legally registered, establishing residence in a jurisdiction where Vance's professional influence would facilitate protection against complex and costly international claims. We immediately consulted with a legal specialist about available options. The news was simultaneously alarming and potentially useful. Although we could not legally prevent the international travel of a mother with full custody, attempts to evade established agreements constituted significant evidence of bad faith, which would potentially strengthen the judicial position for requesting shared custody or expanded rights. We need to implement 2 parallel strategies decided after intense deliberation: immediate legal action to establish formal restrictions, while simultaneously ensuring direct contact with Matthew before a potential departure. The first strategy required an emergency filing before family court requesting temporary restriction of international movement, based on substantial evidence of intent to evade established family responsibilities. Our lawyer, although skeptical about the probability of complete approval, considering Patricia's primary parental rights, considered it feasible to obtain at least a judicial requirement of mandatory notification before any international travel. The second strategy was significantly riskier but potentially more impactful: to unilaterally advance the scheduled visit by presenting ourselves at Patricia's home without prior notification, establishing direct contact with Matthew that would generate both meaningful emotional connection and independent witnesses of positive grandparent-grandson interaction. It is technically compliance with the spirit of the agreement, although not with the specific schedule. Elizabeth justified while we prepared implementation, considering clear evidence of intent to to completely evade commitment, a temporal adjustment seems completely reasonable. We decided to proceed immediately before Patricia potentially implemented additional limitations anticipating our response. The confrontation would be inevitable, but it would occur in territory where legitimate rights, recently reaffirmed, provided formal justification for presence. We arrived at Patricia's residential building approximately at 11 a.m. the next day, a schedule selected strategically when Matthew would likely be present, but sufficiently far from bedtime to justify a substantive visit. The doorman's expression when we mentioned our destination immediately revealed critical information. Mrs. Patricia left this morning with suitcases. She mentioned an important family trip. We had anticipated this possibility and were prepared. I requested immediate communication with the building manager, presenting legal documentation of the recently established family agreement and explaining legitimate concern about potential evasion of parental responsibilities. The manager, initially reluctant but sensitive to potential legal implications of obstruction, finally confirmed crucial information. Patricia had specifically mentioned an international flight scheduled for that same afternoon, while Elizabeth immediately contacted our lawyer to implement available legal actions. I took a decision that would permanently change the dynamic of this confrontation. We would go directly to the airport to confront the situation personally. The city traffic conspired in our favor, allowing us to arrive at the international airport approximately 2 hours before the probable flight identified by Hector. Based on tracked electronic reservations, the international terminal buzzed with typical activity while we systematically scanned the check-in area, looking for familiar faces among the anonymous crowd. Finally, we located them, Patricia, Vance, and Matthew, standing in line for a South American airline, abundant luggage clearly indicating an extensive trip. My heart raced, seeing my grandson for the first time without artificial barriers in more than 7 years. He had grown significantly since the recent birthday, his posture projecting natural curiosity while he observed airport activity. The similarity to Charles at that age was undeniable, provoking simultaneously sharp pain and renewed determination. "We will proceed with absolute calm," I reminded Elizabeth while we approached, "without public scenes that potentially traumatize Matthew. Only presentation of relevant facts." Patricia saw us approximately when we were 10 meters away. Her immediate reaction, visible body tension, rapid glance toward potential exits, urgent communication with Vance, confirmed clear awareness about the impropriety of implemented actions. Patricia. I greeted with deliberate calm when we reached conversational position. "What a coincidence to find you here, especially considering the recent agreement on scheduled visits." Her response combined performative indignation with barely contained nervousness. "It is a brief family trip, completely within my parental rights." 7 suitcases suggest an unusual definition of brief, I observed while Matthew watched us with evident curiosity, particularly combined with an apartment listed for sale and requested complete school documentation. The specific mention of details we should not know visibly destabilized her carefully maintained composure. Vance intervened, trying to regain situational control. Any decision taken is completely oriented toward Matthew's well-being. Discussions about specific arrangements can be continued appropriately through legal representatives. I absolutely agreed with tranquility they evidently did not anticipate. Our lawyer currently implements an emergency request before family court, specifically addressing evident attempt to evade established agreements through unnotified international relocation. This information provoked a revealing reaction from Patricia, genuine fear briefly visible before being suppressed by renewed determination. "You are interfering with legitimate family travel plans," she insisted, although notably avoided directly denying the characterization of underlying intent. During this tense exchange, Elizabeth had maintained constant eye contact with Matthew, who alternated glances between arguing adults and the vaguely familiar woman, smiling warmly at him. "Are you my grandma?" Matthew asked suddenly, his clear voice cutting the tension like an unexpected ray of light. The momentary silence that followed this innocent question provided an opportunity that would permanently change family dynamics. Elizabeth answered with perfect simplicity. "Yes, Matthew. I am your dad, Charles's mom." Patricia immediately tried to interrupt. "Matthew, do not speak. With—" But it was too late. Matthew had taken initiative with the natural curiosity of a child. "I have photos of Dad. He looks like me, exactly like you," confirmed Elizabeth, maintaining conversation focused exclusively on positive connection, avoiding completely any reference to the adult conflict occurring simultaneously. "Why do you never come to see me?" Matthew continued with baffling frankness, typical of children. This innocent but devastatingly relevant question crystallized precisely the core of the entire dispute, exposing crudely the systematic manipulation implemented during years. Before Elizabeth could formulate an appropriately nuanced response, Matthew continued, "Mom says you live very far away, but now you are here." "We lived far away," Elizabeth explained with exquisite care, balancing appropriate honesty with sensitivity toward Matthew's vulnerable position. "But we returned precisely to be able to see you more frequently." Patricia's expression during this exchange revealed gradual but unequivocal recognition. The narrative carefully constructed during years was crumbling irreparably before simple natural interaction between grandmother and grandson. Our lawyer called precisely at that critical moment, providing transformative information. The judge has issued a provisional order restricting international departure pending a formal hearing. Official notification is in process toward airport authorities. This confirmation fundamentally changed the immediate balance of power. Patricia, perceiving correctly practical implications, implemented a quick, complete, strategic recalibration. "Obviously, a significant misunderstanding has occurred," she offered with a notably modified tone. "We were simply exploring international educational options without finalized decisions. Perhaps we should reconsider the schedule to allow more complete discussion about potential arrangements." The transformation was as transparent as it was predictable, facing immediate legal restrictions that effectively would prevent implementation of the original plan. Patricia was transitioning toward a negotiating position, trying to preserve some appearance of authority, while inevitably conceding significant ground. Completely reasonable. I agreed, recognizing implicitly the opportunity for potentially constructive resolution, while firmly maintaining the newly established strategic advantage. Perhaps we could begin implementing the originally agreed visit, for today providing an opportunity for Matthew to reconnect with grandparents who have waited for this moment for 7 years. The look exchange between Patricia and Vance communicated reluctant but clear recognition of transformed reality. Complete judicial confrontation would likely result significantly more damaging than negotiated concessions from an evidently weakened position. "We could have lunch together," suggested Vance, assuming again the role of practical mediator. "There is a suitable family restaurant right here in the terminal." Matthew, completely oblivious to underlying adult complexities, but perfectly attuned to unexpected opportunity, responded with genuine enthusiasm. "Yes, I want a burger with fries." This apparently trivial moment, a child expressing simple food preference, represented simultaneously profound victory and transformative starting point. First family decision implemented collectively respecting Matthew's voice, while adults navigated complex rebalancing of shared responsibilities. While we headed toward the restaurant, Elizabeth discreetly squeezed my hand, communicating silently shared understanding. This did not represent complete resolution, but significant beginning of inevitably complex but potentially constructive process. 2 years have passed since that decisive confrontation at the airport. The transition from systematic exclusion toward functional co-parenting has been predictably challenging but surprisingly productive. The legal agreement finally established provides clear structure while preserving necessary flexibility. Alternate weekends with grandparents, school holidays divided equally, unrestricted digital communication, and shared participation in significant educational decisions. Patricia, although initially resistant, gradually recognized practical benefits of expanded family support, particularly after Vance effectively received a professional offer in Chile that required frequent international travel. The availability of fully involved grandparents provided invaluable logistical and emotional stability for Matthew. The question of biological paternity, although never formally resolved through a genetic test, has gradually lost centrality in family dynamics. Matthew undoubtedly shows physical, intellectual, and temperamental characteristics that reflect the Miller lineage regardless of specific genetic contribution. More significantly, he has flourished under the combined influence of diverse but complementary adult figures in his life. The passion for architecture that Charles demonstrated from an early age emerges clearly in Matthew's fascination with structures, spaces, and three-dimensional design. His school notebooks frequently contain surprisingly sophisticated sketches for a 9-year-old boy. This afternoon, while I watch Matthew working concentratedly on an elaborate architectural model we are building together, a detailed recreation of the first significant project of Miller and Associates, I reflect on the extraordinary transformation since that devastating moment during the birthday party. Patricia's cruel words, "That grandson is not even yours," which initially provoked unbearable pain, now seem curiously irrelevant, facing the reality lived daily. A deep connection between generations that transcends completely limited biological considerations. Elizabeth enters the studio silently observing with evident satisfaction the scene of intergenerational collaboration. Matthew, perceiving her presence, looks up with a smile that illuminates the entire room. "Grandma, do you think we could add a solar panel system like the ones I saw in your book? It would be completely sustainable." Elizabeth joins us at the work table, automatically assuming a complementary role in the shared project, exactly as she has done during 60 years of professional and personal collaboration with me. "Excellent idea, Architect Miller." She responds with seriousness that genuinely respects the child's enthusiasm. "Perhaps we could investigate together more efficient options available currently." While they work together, Matthew's profile momentarily captures exactly the same concentrated expression that characterized Charles during moments of creative inspiration. The visible continuity through generations provokes simultaneously sharp pain of permanent loss and deep gratitude for preserved connection. What Patricia never completely understood, and what finally established the foundation for constructive resolution, is a fundamental truth about authentic family. It transcends completely limited biological or legally technical definitions, residing instead in a complex fabric of emotional connections, shared values, and sustained commitments through inevitably changing circumstances. The true legacy does not reside primarily in physical structures or material assets, but in the continuity of perspectives, values, and capabilities transmitted organically between generations, linked by something infinitely more significant than specific genetic sequences. Matthew, regardless of technical chromosomal contribution, is indisputably the heir to the Miller legacy. Aesthetic sensitivity, professional integrity, and capacity to visualize transformative possibilities in apparently ordinary spaces. When Patricia screamed those words intended to permanently destroy family connection, she inadvertently catalyzed precisely the confrontation necessary to establish a fundamentally more powerful truth. Genuine family is built through consistent presence, unconditional love, an intentional transmission of shared values. Matthew looks up again, observing the result of our collaborative work with evident satisfaction. It is perfect, Grandpa, exactly as I imagined it. And in that simple declaration, I find the definitive answer to public humiliation that initially seemed insurmountable. This boy is indisputably mine, ours, in the only sense that genuinely matters. The shared connection transcends completely biological technicalities, residing instead in infinitely more significant territory of love freely offered and joyfully received. Yes, Matthew, I respond, while Elizabeth discreetly wipes a fugitive tear. It is exactly as it should be.